I'm gonna run briefly through the historical part. I apologize for that, but if we want to cover a lot of ground in a very short time, this is how it's gonna happen. But do feel free to ask all the questions later in the chat, and I do hope that I'll be able to answer all of your questions, and you're always welcome to reach out to me after that as well. So, okay, let's get started. Let me see. Okay, sorry. I don't know if you can. I'm sorry, guys, my computer suddenly is very slow. Okay. I'm sorry, can you see the first slide? My journey to China. Has it changed for you?
We got it.
Yes.
Amazing.
Okay, so you got it. Okay. So my journey to China. As you can see from the picture, I grew up in the very south of Israel. This is close to Eilat, where I spent most of my childhood, and my parents still live. And this picture was taken last year when I got stuck in Israel for 7 months, trying to get back to China. So I was, as a last resort, tried to hitchhike my way back to Shanghai, which of course didn't work. But if we're going back, so I'm Israeli, as Danny said, Israeli born and raised, and very much of the south of Israel. And I ended up in the big city of Shanghai, 25 million people. And I'm loving it. And I'm definitely calling it my home today. So what happened in 2009, actually before, but I was a student at Haifa University up in the north of Israel. And I majored in Asia studies, political science, kind of specialized in China. I took all my studies about China, all my courses. And in 2009 was the first time that I, along with some other friends, other students, all of us got scholarship to get back to go to China, to study Mandarin for the summer. And so in 2009, I found myself first in Shanghai. Course, very exciting and incredible experience. And in our very, very busy curriculum organized by the local Shanghai University, there was one activity that was supposed to take us to visit the Jewish church. And none of us understood what a Jewish church is. So we went to ask the head of the program, a Chinese woman, is it a church or a synagogue? And of course, she had no idea that there is a difference between a church and a synagogue. So she offered that maybe that was actually a temple. Now, for Israeli Jews, when you say a temple, we think of a Buddhist place. So that did not convince us that it is Jewish. We said, okay, we'll go, we see what it is. And that visit actually started a very important and very, very interesting journey for me of discovering Jewish Shanghai. So we got to this place, to the building. It was quite far from where our university was. And this is the first thing we see, a sign that says that we arrived at the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. And I remember looking at it and asking myself, what did Jewish refugees do in Shanghai? And what's the connection? And we go in, and it's a very nice building, 2-3 stories building. You cannot say a lot from the outside. The door kind of like looked Jewish style, but you never know. And you go in, and this is what we see. And so, of course, you cannot mistake it. That's very much a synagogue. So we sit there and we hear the story of a group of Jewish people who made it to Shanghai during World War II, before and during World War II, as refugees. And I'm sitting there and I'm amazed because I've never heard of any Jewish connection to China, and definitely not to Shanghai, nothing. And studying in an Israeli university, specialized in China, never hearing about that, that was a major thing for me. So coming back after that summer semester to university to finish my studies, I actually asked my professors, how come they never said anything? And they said, between 5,000 years of Chinese history and the philosophy and the new times and the language and everything else you had to study, they couldn't just find the place and the time to fit that story in. So they never did. I found it really weird, very, very strange. And so I started to dig in and try to find as much information as possible as I could about the topic. And I realized there is a whole world, a huge, huge area in history that I had no idea about. And you might find it also surprising to know that there is very little actually written in Hebrew. There's a lot written in English. You can find a lot of books, a lot of memoirs, a lot of reports, even online if you just Google them, very simple, but almost nothing written in Hebrew. So it was a big revelation for me and a big discovery. And so I started reading and started trying to figure out more about the Jewish connection to China. In 2010, I went back to Shanghai, this time for a job. It was a 6 month project. It was very nice, just fresh out of school to find a job in China. I was very excited about it. And when that was over, I decided to stay. I stayed in Shanghai and I opened my own company. I started as a tour guide. And I made a promise to myself that if it's up to me, every one of the tourists that comes to Shanghai and travels with me, I will take them to see and to visit the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum and tell them about the story. Because if I haven't heard about it, I assumed that a lot of other people didn't. And it was very important for me to make sure that this part of history is being told. So in the first few years in Shanghai, when I built the business, when I had a lot of travelers, I told the story quite a lot of times. And I made very good connection with the management of the Refugees Museum. So much so that I was very, very lucky to have them send me on their behalf in 2014 to join Shanghai Landers Reunion in the US. So you need to understand that the largest group of former Shanghai Jewish people, or China even you can say, Jews who lived in China, lives today in the US. There are several other groups, pretty big one in Australia. There is definitely a group in Israel and in North America, not just in the US, but also in Canada. There is a small group in South Africa, but the largest, the majority is in the US. And I was sent in 2014 on behalf of the museum, taking a note from the curator and the manager of the museum, addressing the reunion. Now you can see here on the bottom left, a picture of some of those who joined the reunion. Now, in previous years, there were thousands and then hundreds of them who joined the reunions that they had on this cruise. And that was a cruise specifically in memory of their parents that took them on the cruise that changed their lives, that saved their lives. There were only 8 of them. And the age range was from 78, that was the youngest, to 92. There was 2 of them. You can see this woman here and this man here, 92 years old. So not that many of them could make it to the trip, to the cruise. But I was lucky enough to make it in time and meet with them. And for the first time, actually meet the refugees that I've heard so much about and hear the stories from them. And after the cruise was over, I was fortunate to stay at this lovely lady's home, where she also organized a gathering and invited to her place some of her former Shanghai schoolmates. And she put out a note in different channels throughout the community and community center to try and reach out others that she might not have known about, to join us so that I can meet with them and interview them. And you can see this picture in the middle, the bottom center of this man, that his wife saw the advertisement somewhere, the note, and she made him come. He never thought of joining anything like that. She forced him to join. And that was actually the first time that he ever told the story. and it was all recorded. He told the story. His wife remembered some things that she heard from his mother. So it was a fascinating, amazing experience for me, and that's where I actually decided to start the China Jewish Project. So since then, since 2014, I've managed to travel several times to the US and of course in Israel. And whenever I went, I tried to meet with as many former China Jewish people that I could find and interview them, record their stories, either by video or just an audio recording, get as many documents or at least copies of their documents that they have, um, and keep them as a small archive, which I still keep just with myself. I haven't found a place to put it yet, where others could research and enjoy learning about this part of history. Another thing that I found out when I started digging in and reading about this fascinating history, at least fascinating to me, I realized that there were quite a lot of other communities living in China way before the refugees from Europe arrived. And so, if we're talking about old Jewish communities of China, and as Danny said, spanning back in history all the way to the 10th century, at least as far as we can tell, even 9th century in some records, we have to mention these communities. Let me, say here. Okay, so the first one, or the most ancient one, the oldest one that we can talk about is the Kaifeng community, the Kaifeng Jews. Kaifeng historically is considered one of the 7 ancient capitals of China. And it's, for a certain time in history, for quite several centuries, it was a bustling center of commerce, business, politics, culture. So it was a very, very important city. If you can see where it's located, it's actually at the end of several of the Silk Roads that came through from Western China all the way to this area. And it was also situated near the Grand Canal. So the canal that was built between, to connect, north and south of China. So very central, very important place and city. And so we estimate that the Jews that settled there settled because of the opportunities, because of the business options that they had. But where did they come from? How did they make it there? That's still a bit of a mystery. There are several researches that were done about this. And one of them, let me show you, is talking actually about a missionary. So the first record, historical record that we have of a Jewish community in Kaifeng is actually was done by one of the disciples of Matteo Ricci. They arrived in China around 15th century, and one of his missionaries started traveling around China to try and convert local populations. And he made it to Kaifeng, as we said, was a very important city at the time. So he made it to Kaifeng, and standing in the city center and town center and kind of like preaching his beliefs. When he finished, a man approached him and asked him and told him, we also believe in one God. That missionary thought that, oh, so lucky, I can get to meet other Christians. So he asked the man to show him the way to his spiritual leader. Now, put into context, you have to understand and remember, back in those days, there was no one language all over China. So you had to be educated in the central language of Beijing to be able, and actually the 10th century is the central language of Nanjing, not Beijing, but to be able to converse across China with different populations. So it's not like the Mandarin of today, where everywhere you go in China, people can understand you because they all speak at least one common language. And also, when we're talking about terms like spiritual leader or religion, these are not necessarily local terms in China. So they were translated from other language, Latin most likely. So we don't exactly know how that conversation went, but the so-called Jewish or Christian, suspected Christian men took the missionary to meet with his spiritual leader. And they sat down, they had a conversation, and the missionary said, recorded in his memoirs after that, that he was surprised to find out that that spiritual leader was not aware that the Messiah arrived, referring to Jesus. And concluding from that, he said that this is probably a Jewish community. Many centuries after, and it took a long time until that community was discovered, they already looked a little bit more what you can see in the pictures. So what do we know about the Kaifeng Jews of today? It's a very, very, very small community. There is no synagogue the way it used to be, as you can see in the picture on the right. This is a picture, a drawing of what used to be the Kaifeng synagogue. It looks very much like a traditional Chinese courtyard of, let's say, a very rich family or a merchant family. So it's a very traditional Chinese local, it's nothing special in that sense. But there are records of Kaifeng Jews at least recording or explaining that their ancestors were merchants that came via the Silk Road, and they were of Jewish origins. And they married, they all were men, and so they married with locals. And there are actually tablets of those marriages where you see the Hebrew name marrying Bat Adam, a daughter of Adam, you would say. So the local woman's name was not specified, but she was classified as human, as a daughter of Adam, let's say. And that was the marriage. So there are certificates like that. So many centuries after, the next time that we actually hear about them is by the Jewish communities that lived in China in the 19th century, that they met with them. And they were inconclusive on whether or not they could consider them Jews. Now, there are a lot of speculations about the Kaifeng Jews. I can tell you that in Israel, they're not considered Jewish. They are considered Jewish in some parts of the Jewish world globally. Some of them did make aliyah to Israel and converted to Judaism according to the Israeli state regulations, if you would like, to the way that the conversion is recognized in Israel. And so, but they see themselves as Jews. They do gather, the small community that is there is gathering during the holidays, the Jewish holidays. They're gathering every Friday night. They eat kosher sort of in our ways of kosher. So they don't eat pork, they don't eat shellfish. There's not much milk in China anyway, so they're not really mixing milk and dairy and meat. So they did keep some of the traditions, but not a lot. I had a friend 10 years back that was living there because he studied Chinese. So he helped name the children, giving them middle names, Hebrew middle names. So they do care about their origins and Jewish tradition and Jewish heritage, but they're not, but their Judaism is a bit of a topic, a sensitive topic, even if you'd like, within the Jewish world of today. But the next time that we meet Jewish communities, actual formal, let's say, communities in China, would be almost a millennia after that first historical recording of the Kaifeng Jews. And this would bring us to the Sephardic community in Shanghai. So I don't know how many of you are aware of the Opium Wars. You probably have heard the term before. In a nutshell, these were wars around whether or not Great Britain would be allowed to trade in opium in China. The Chinese did not want to. The British Empire wanted to. They were stronger. They won the war. In 1842, there was more than one war, but in 1842, there was the Treaty of Nanking, the first peace agreement, and I say peace quote unquote because it wasn't exactly in favor of China. And among the several things that China had to give up and give because of that treaty was two things that relevant for the Jewish community is the island of Hong Kong, which they officially gave in 1847 for 100 years. It was given back in 1997, so a bit more than 100 years. And then some territory within mainland China. And the first place that they gave was Shanghai. And so with Shanghai opening up to the British Empire and British citizens or netizens, if you would like, this family on the left, the Sassoon family, was the first Jewish one to travel to China and find a location, a very central location, to establish their branch of business over there, the Sassoon family business. Sassoon family came from Baghdad, so they are Iraqi Jews. The head of the family, in our case, David Sassoon, had to escape Baghdad. And during his travels, he ended up in Mumbai, in India. That's where he brought his family to and decided to settle in. India at that time was already part of the British Empire. So he could buy his way to become British national. And again, when more and more places opened in the Far East, he, like what the Rothschild family did in Europe, he sent his sons to open houses and open branches of the family business everywhere that was open. And that's how they made it to China. The Sassoon family basically paved the way for other Jews to get jobs in many places around Asia, and definitely in Shanghai. So they created workplaces. And so the first Jews that we see coming to Shanghai came to work for the Sassoons. Many of them either came with their families or came as single, usually just men at the beginning, and then went back sometimes to India, sometimes to Baghdad, all the way to find wives, and then return to China with their families. And the Sephardi community that was built in Shanghai was the longest one living there, almost for a whole century. Actually, a little bit more than a whole century, because they started in 1845. Many of them were driven out with the rise of communism at the end of the 1940s of the century after, 1947, 8, 9, and the beginning of 1950s. So for a whole century, they built in Shanghai, they flourished. It was a very successful, very rich, affluent community. Besides the Sassoon family, you can see the Kaduri family, another very famous name. This is one of the brothers that came to work for Sassoons, and then they branched out and had their own businesses. Kaduri family is also the only one that still lives in the area. They live in Hong Kong. Sir Michael Kaduri and his family, they live in Hong Kong. They own quite a lot of Hong Kong Island in property. They are also the owners of the Peninsula Hotel chain. The first one was built in Hong Kong. There is one in Shanghai. They're big benefactors of and supporters of the different communities of Hong Kong until today, and big supporters of China opening up. Other families that you can see is the Toeg family, the Jacobs, there were the Abrahams, there were the Shahmun families. This man here is Hardun, also very, very rich, came to work for the Sassoons and then later branched out and had his own business. It is important to mention that quite big portion of the business of these very affluent and rich Jewish families, at least at the beginning, was dealing with opium as well. That's how they made most of their fortunes. Later on, it was stopped. So it was not 100 years of dealing with opium, of trading with opium, but definitely the beginning of the story. So the Sephardi community was the first to settle in Shanghai and really build the city, even until today. And you have to understand that even today in Shanghai, the elders of Shanghai remember, really until today, remember those affluent Jews and how good they were at business. And it's part of also how the way they see Jews until today. Let's see, what did I have for you next? So I put this map here to better illustrate where the different Jewish communities lived in Shanghai. You see the Chinese city. This is the old Shanghai city. It was walled. It was surrounded by a wall that does not longer exist today. This is a very old city. It was established sometime in the first millennium. But then came the foreigners. And so the British actually first settled around this area, which today is known as the Bund, okay? And later, after the British came in, the Americans who settled around this area, the French that started here very modestly. And little by little, all of these exterritorial agreements grew into these huge areas that until today, by the way, consist of most of downtown Shanghai and the center and most important place, let's say, area of the city. So the Sephardic community actually ended up settling around this area mostly, Babbling Well Road, where also they built Ohel Rachel, the synagogue that they most attended. There was another synagogue built around this area by Farjun, was named Beit Aharon, later to be used by the Mir Yeshiva, if any one of you ever heard of those stories. I'm happy to speak a little bit more about it afterwards. But it was less in use. Yes, these are the synagogues. Wait, I'll get back to it. I just want to make sure I'm showing you all the locations. This is today People's Square of Shanghai. It used to be horse racing tracks. And it still remained as the circular road like that. The Ashkenazi community, the second community to settle in Shanghai, consists mostly of Russian Jews at the beginning, settled around this area in the French concession. It's important to say that the communities were connected. They did a lot of business together. They supported each other in times of need, but each community formed its own organizations, even had their own buildings and centers. So the Russian community had its own synagogue as well, which they moved at some point to this area. Why did they do that? Because the actual refugees, the first actual refugees to come to Shanghai, came from the north of China, from the city of Harbin, and they were Russian. So when they started escaping north of China due to war and well, a lot of terrorism, you can call it, by Russians, anti-Semite Russians that were left there, and the Japanese that took over the north of China, many of them escaped into Shanghai, and because they had to leave everything behind, they were very poor. And settling around this area was much cheaper than settling in downtown Shanghai. So the Russian community actually moved the synagogue here and rebuilt it, named Ohel Moshe, which is today the Jewish Refugees Museum. Later on, many of those Russian Jews actually managed to move to the French concession, and the new wave of refugees, those who came from Europe, settled around this area, and so they could use and benefit from Ohel Moshe synagogue. So I'll show you a little bit of the synagogues. This is a picture from above of Ohel Rachel. There is at the entrance the beautiful wordings of in Hebrew. Oh my God, I cannot remember it now. Something along, you be welcome, you be blessed by welcome and going. It's not all exist anymore. It was destroyed a little bit, so it's a bit broken, but it's here. That's the entrance. This is a picture that I took. So we do get to visit Ohel Rachel, although it's most of the year closed because it's part of the Shanghai Education Bureau. So it's a government building. It was open to us in 2010 to us as a Jewish community at large. And so we get to visit it and use it 5 times a year for the high holidays, for Hanukkah if we want, for Purim. And I think we're also using it, or we can choose to use it. So sometimes we take it for Independence Day, celebrating Independence Day, Israel's Independence Day, and of course, the Holocaust, commemorating the Holocaust Day. So We can use it 5 times a year. When it's been used, it's been organized and managed by the Chabad rabbi that is not so living not so far from that area. The one in the middle is the only evidence, let's say, and record that we have of Beit Aharon, the second synagogue that was built by Khardun, and the only picture that we have of the Mir Yeshiva that actually managed to use it, Beit Aharon. This synagogue was destroyed in the 1950s, not because it meant something in terms of religion, let's say, to the Chinese, but because it was sitting on a very important um, and priced piece of land. So they destroyed it in order to build another building. And funny enough, they never did. This area still stands empty and is used as a car parking lot, you can say. So they never actually managed to build anything on it. But we have very, very few pictures of it. And of course, of the Mir Yeshiva. And this is Ohel Moshe, which is today part of the Jewish Refugees Museum. It's well maintained, but it's not so much in use. It is being used by a little bit the Reform progressive community of Shanghai, mostly because it's situated, it's located very, very far away from where all of us live. So it's quite a bit of a hike to get there, a journey, let's say, together. And it's also managed by the government as part of the museum. So if anyone wants to use it as a synagogue or for any religious activities, they have to rent it out and they have to get permission to use it for that cause, for that reason. So these are the old, let's say, synagogues of Shanghai. And jumping to Harbin, and I am trying to make it short, and I'm sure I'm not making it as short as maybe I hoped, but I do want to tell you those stories. So Harbin community started forming in the late 1800s, so 1892 onwards. It was a city managed by Russians, part of the agreement between Russia and China as part of building the Trans-Siberian train into China, so cutting through China and making it shorter. So Harbin was the only city that was built and was built by Russians. It was completely Russian, and therefore a very easy location for a lot of Jews to escape pogroms and escape anti-Semitism from Russia and make it to a place that was Russian enough, but far enough from Tsarist Russia at the time. And the community there was very big, very Zionist as well. There were few Zionist organizations. 2 synagogues were open there. The old and the new, 6 months difference between them, but still the old and the new. And both of them today operate as museums, as you can see the picture here on the bottom left. It was a 20,000 people community, quite big. They had a Jewish school, they had a kitchen helping the needs. It wasn't as rich and affluent as the one in Shanghai, the ones in Shanghai, but it was well-to-do enough. They really supported each other. They got some support from Russia, from Jewish organizations as well. Some of its members ventured outside of Harbin to other smaller cities in the area for business reasons. They might call it different smaller communities, but if we are true to the community kind of definition, they weren't big enough to be called communities, but still definitely a Jewish point on the map. So most of these Jews had to escape Harbin around 1925, and many of them found themselves in Shanghai. 10, 15 years after that would come the group of refugees from Europe. So Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, European, mostly secular, but not only. We are talking about the Mir Yeshiva, which is a different refugee group coming from Eastern Europe, a bit later, 1941, 42, arriving in Shanghai. A lot of small, different communities, but Shanghai was the biggest place, probably the only city with an actual community, and then Harbin, of course. Then you had Tianjin, a very small community in Beijing. All of these formed because of business opportunities mostly, or because of necessity, like the refugees. They had no other place to go. And more important to say, all of these actually ended around 1950. Beginning of 1950s, with the exception of the Russian Jews living in Shanghai that could not easily leave China. They were considered as white Russians in Russia, so not so easy to go back to Russia, communist Russia at the time. But everywhere around the world, they were, as Russians, immediately considered as communists. So a lot of countries around the world did not want to get them. And they got stuck in China, not all of them, but some of them, even until mid-50s, mid-60s, some of them. Majority of that community ended up in Australia eventually, sorry. So the communities, the current communities, Jewish communities of China, are actually the ones that started from the 1980s onwards. And the first Jews to come were actually American Jews, because America was the first to regularize, that's not the right word, but I'm sure you understand me, to reconnect with China, let's say, and reopen relationship with China. And so these were the first Jews to make it to China, and actually first to Beijing. So wait, I'll take you back just to give you a brief kind of like look on the map. So Beijing was actually the first community. It was more informal, a group of friends, American mostly, that started gathering for Shabbat dinners and for holidays. It grew very quickly, very fast, with more and more countries reconnecting, reopening, normalizing relationships with China. And so more and more nationalities came, but it started with a group of Americans, actually a very dedicated one woman, and later with her husband, that is still the head of the community until today. And Shanghai was the second place, and mostly because of business opportunities. Today, Shanghai community is the largest. And even though we cannot say anymore that there are 1,500 Jews living in Shanghai because COVID hit us pretty hard, it is still the largest one in China today. Hong Kong community was the only one, and is the only one, that had a historical continuity. So the former community and the current community, although the current one, the present one, might be a bit different because it consists from a lot of people who just moved for work. But there are a lot of, not a lot, but some families or some Jewish connections that are still there from old times. Guangzhou community is a pretty big one as well. Chengdu is very, very small, but still exists. Kunming, I don't think survived until today. I do know that there are some Jews living in that area. It is Yunnan province. Kunming is the capital of Yunnan province. So I do know of some Jews who live around that area, but I don't know if they have sort of a community life. And then Yiwu, it's an industrial city not too far from Shanghai. That is very, very important for business and commerce. So it's mostly an Israeli community living there, but it is a community. So let's take you a little bit through the Shanghai communities. All current communities, as we said, are new. Chabad of Shanghai was the first one to form a real community here and a community center. The rabbi you see in the middle, this is him, Shalom Greenberg. It was the first to come to Shanghai a little more than 20 years now. He lives here still with his wife and children and family. The eldest already out of China, the three eldest ones actually already out of China. And the youngest one should be 2, maybe already 3 years old. So Baruch Hashem, as they say, a very big family. He lives here. His brother also opened another Chabad house, and there is a third Chabad house, the one that is managing Ohel Rachel. So 3 centers of Chabad. They are not the only, but almost the exclusive source of kosher food in Shanghai and the area. There is another Chabad house in Beijing who provides kosher food. and another one in Chengdu, and two more in Guangzhou, and another one in Yiwu. But that's it. And of course, Hong Kong has its own. So for kosher food, it's pretty difficult. If you're a religious Jew who keeps kosher, you probably will stick to one of these cities around China. They were the first in Shanghai, as we said. There are three of them today. They operate a Jewish kindergarten, a Jewish school, and a Hebrew school as well. And this picture was taken at the beginning of the pandemic last year. One of the things that Rabbi Greenberg is very keen on is to preserve a good relationship with Hongkou area. That's where the museum is and the old Jewish ghetto. So he makes sure, and we try to make sure that we keep good connection with the local community that is living there today. One of the things that they did was buying quite a lot of masks that were in need, especially in that area. A lot of older people that were not fast enough to run and buy masks, so they didn't have any. And they went on, and with the volunteers of the museum, they went to give away and those masks to the local population. It's very important to say that this is not the only Orthodox community in Shanghai. We also have the JCC, the Jewish Community Center, operated by a Sephardic community. Their headquarters, if you'd like, or the main branch is in Hong Kong and then in Israel. And so they operate also a smaller community center, but a thriving one, very active and busy one in Shanghai. So they are another Orthodox community and another source of supply for kosher food if in need. But then another community in Shanghai is the liberal/reform progressive community. That's a lot of terms, I know. They identify themselves as part of the progressive synagogue, I would say. I think that's the largest or the strongest one in APAC. And so they are identified as the progressive community of Shanghai. They would identify themselves and say that they're a very liberal community. They don't have a rabbi, so the rabbis that do come to join in the holidays, mostly the high holidays and then during Passover, are usually Reform rabbis, and this is the pool of rabbis that are coming here. They are the youngest community in Shanghai. They just celebrated 11 years. They operate Tov, which is good in Hebrew, for those of you who don't know. It's a Sunday Hebrew school for adults and for kids. It's mostly a mixed community, as you can see, mixed cultural community. They operate all sorts of small activity groups like the Scotch and Cigar, the Jewish Young Professionals. It's kind of like excuses to meet and gather and do things as a community. They do not have a center. All Chabad houses have houses, so it's centers. The JCC have a center. The liberal community does not have one center. They kind of like scattered all over the city. So for the high holidays, for example, or other old holidays, or sometimes Shabbat dinners when they all want to meet, they take over a banquet at a hotel and host a meal together. This picture was taken during the pandemic, so we wanted to know who is where around the world. And people sent their location, and we created a map, and every Friday we would meet online for a Shabbat service together. It didn't matter where you are around the world, to kind of like keep a community sense, a sense of community, and stay connected. Unfortunately, a lot of the people from this community and all other communities could not return to China. And so the community now is estimated to be around 200, 300 people, not more. I do have to say that the French Jews kind of like keep a little bit to themselves. So I have no idea about their numbers, but everyone else, around maybe 200 of us still living in Shanghai.
This
So
is
what do
so amazing, Yael. I'm so sorry to come in. I do know we're getting really close to the hour, and I would love to throw a couple of questions because we have
Yes, please
very,
go
very
ahead.
many.
Please
Okay,
go ahead.
thank you so much. This has been absolutely incredible. I'm blown away with all of the information, as many people are, because we've been getting tons of comments with unbelievable connections. Yael, I'll have to
Ooh,
save the transcript and send it to you
please do.
because there's so many people with family that have come through Shanghai or descendants, relatives, and people who've written books about their own family's history. It's absolutely astounding. No one else can see this because a lot of these comments have come to me personally, but we'll be happy to share those
Please
afterwards with
do.
you.
Please do. And I'm also
Um,
sharing here my
Go ahead.
my email. Please feel
Yes,
and if you don't get to me, go get to Danny and
yes,
him to make the connection. Don't worry. I want to hear you out. So
yes.
you want me to stop share so we can see
No,
everyone?
keep the sharing there so people can take pictures with your email address so they can have
Okay.
that. Many people have asked for your contact already. And I'm just going to kind of rapid fire these questions because, like I said, there's so many.
No worries.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so really quickly, from way back when you started and you shared with us about the museum, very quickly, when did this museum open? Do you happen to know the year of that?
2008.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Also, two quick questions. Do you happen to know about the Russian Jews who would have come to China after the Russian Revolution in the early 1920s? There were at least 3,000 to 5,000 white Russian Jews is one question. And a similar, do you know about the refugees who went to Shanghai or went from Shanghai to Susua, Dominican Republic in 1947?
Hmm. No, so okay. First of all, yes, a lot of refugees escaped. I call them refugees. I'm sure you
Sure.
understand one. Escaped Russia after the revolution, and yes, and made it to mostly Harbin first. That was the easiest connection, the closest also to Russia. But many of them also descended went down south to Shanghai. Another place that we do know that a lot of them arrived in was Tianjin City.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other names I can check and find the actual names because they're very long ones in Russian that I don't remember, but I can send out that information. But yes, we do know because Russian Jews kept coming from Russia for different reasons. There were pogroms at 1895 as well. So some of the people just left everything behind and made it to China. Most of the time, their first point of arrival was Harbin. It was easier because
Okay.
it was known and there was a Jewish community there.
Got it. Cassie's wondering if you knew where the Sephardic community actually originated from, and if you happen to know if there were any conversos from Spain that actually would have made it to Shanghai.
So as far as we know, but wait, first the Dominican Republic, I have no idea about that, and I would love to know
Okay,
more if any one of you do. I would love to learn
great.
more about this. So just to close that, but where the Sephardic community came from Baghdad, so many of them actually arrived directly from Baghdad to Shanghai, but that was a bit later in years when the community also already started forming in Shanghai. So there were job opportunities. That's why the young boys, let's say, or young men from Baghdad had a reason to go, or they were recruited for work in Shanghai. You know how it is. I know someone in the
Yeah,
synagogue that knows someone in the synagogue, and that's how it works. And my son looking for a job, and that's how it goes. And
right.
even if it's all the way in Shanghai. So so some of them actually originated directly from Baghdad. Some of them arrived directly from Mumbai in India.
Okay,
Later in the years, some of them came from Europe, so mostly the UK, but also a little bit from France. We don't know, at least I don't have any record of someone who came specifically from Spain. There could have been,
okay.
but I don't have any knowledge about that.
Got it. This is an interesting one. How do people who are single and Jewish get on in Shanghai today, presently?
Whew. Well, not the easiest times, especially not in today's Shanghai.
Okay.
Um, yeah, you're welcome to export to Shanghai. We'll be happy. We have some singles here. Yeah, no, but jokes aside, one of the things that, so if you are looking for the Jewish connection, then you would go to Chabad or
Okay.
you would go to the Jewish Reform community, let's say,
Right.
the activities that are like the Scotch and Cigar, the Jewish Young Professionals. So there are activities, there are ways to find other Jewish people. It is
Okay.
advertised. So when there are holidays, it will be advertised. So you could find where to find other Jews. And usually it's just like, in old times when a Jewish person comes to Shanghai, his entire family back at home and his connections will try to find a connection in the Jewish community in Shanghai to get them connected. And that's one of the beauties of being, Jewish. You are connected to a community no matter where you are in the world.
Right.
So
It's a
yeah, that
beautiful
still
thing.
exists in Shanghai. Yeah.
Just a couple more. Well, we're going to do our best to get as many questions in as possible.
Okay.
Why, out of curiosity, did the present map of the communities, it didn't include Kaifeng? Aren't the latest Shamesh daughters still taking care of the place at Jewish Street?
So we don't even know if she's still living in Kaifeng today, to be
Okay.
honest. Yeah. So we don't really know how much of the community is still active today. We also try, and that's important to understand. Um, it's difficult in China, um, especially for Chinese nationals, to practice a religion that is not a recognized religion. And I think you've mentioned it at the beginning, Danny,
Mm-hmm.
that Judaism is not a recognized religion in China. So what does it mean? By being a recognized religion, meaning that it's been monitored and being organized or being managed somehow within the government. Okay, so it is being watched. Being watched could be a good thing because it's been funded. They're being given money to have their operations and centers and everything. But it's also being carefully monitored in case of fanatics, coming out of it and creating a movement that could potentially take a lot of people against the current regime. Now, it is important to know it's not something new to present China. And Danny is smiling because I keep saying that in other presentations as well. This is a
Right.
very old practice in China. Every time that there was a potential of another force to take over the one in charge, it was considered as a potential threat. So it is being treated the same here. Now, why Judaism is not recognized in China? Because there's not masses of people who are practicing it. Christianity, yes, for sure. So two Christian, the Catholic Christianity and Protestant Christianity are recognized in China, the churches. Islam is recognized in China. Buddhism is recognized in China because a lot of people are practicing it. Judaism in China was practiced maybe by a very small community in Kaifeng, that even the Jewish communities that were in China back in the days did not know if to recognize them as Jews. So that made a lot of issues with the Chinese authorities, how to recognize them. So they are recognized as a minority, but their religion is not recognized as something that needs to be watched. And therefore, us as foreigners in China practicing Judaism under the supervision and the allowance, technically, the mandate that the local government gave us, because they allow us to practice it. We can practice it freely, no problem. We don't no need to be afraid or ashamed or hide it. On the contrary, we are celebrated as Jews in China. But as foreigners, we're not allowed to do it together with Chinese. And that's true to all religions. Christians, foreign Christians, are not allowed to practice Christianity in Chinese churches. And that separation is being kept. And because of that, we try to respect it and not bring too much troubles on the maybe still continuous existing Jewish community in Kaifeng. So we don't have community ties. We might have individual ties, but not community ties. And that's why I did not recognize the Kaifeng Jews on the current Jewish communities of China today.